August 21, 1945. Washington, D.C. The most destructive war in human history is technically over. Japan has surrendered. Germany is in ruins. In the Oval Office, President Harry S. Truman picks up a fountain pen and signs a document that will do more damage to the British Empire than the Luftwaffe ever managed in 6 years of bombing. With a single signature, Truman abruptly terminates Lend-Lease. This was the massive program that had shipped billions of dollars worth of food, oil, and ammunition to the Allies for free. For the United States, it was a line item in a war budget. But for Great Britain, it was the only thing keeping the lights on. The news hit London like a physical blow. Prime Minister Clement Attlee, who had only been in power for a few weeks, received the cable at 10 Downing Street. The reality was terrifying. Britain had stopped exporting goods to fight the Nazis. They had sold every foreign investment they owned. They had emptied the treasury of gold. For 5 years, the British population had been eating American wheat, burning American oil, and shooting American bullets, all on credit or as a gift. Now, the Americans were pulling the plug. Not in 6 months. Immediately. Lord Keynes, the most famous economist in the world and an advisor to the Treasury, did the math on the back of an envelope. Without American money, Britain would run out of food in roughly 4 weeks. The ration for bread, already lower than it had been during the height of the war, would have to be cut to starvation levels. The British Empire had won the war, but in the summer of 1945, it was about to discover that it had lost the balance sheet. They didn't have a military problem, they had a solvency problem. And the price of survival would be the empire itself. To understand how the victor of World War II ended up a beggar at the doorstep of its closest ally, we have to look at the financial architecture of the war. We often learn about the Blitz, the Battle of Britain, and D-Day. We rarely learn about cash and carry. In 1940, before the United States joined the war, they were happy to sell weapons to Britain, but only for cold, hard cash. There was no credit. President Roosevelt was sympathetic, but American law was strict. If Churchill wanted destroyers and rifles, he had to pay in gold or dollars. So Britain held a fire sale. They began liquidating the family silver. British officials quietly seized the private American assets of British citizens, shares in railroads, steel mills, and factories, and sold them on the New York Stock Exchange to raise dollars. It was a desperate, secret liquidation of national wealth. The most humiliating moment came in 1941 with the sale of the American Viscose Corporation. This was a crown jewel of British industry, a massive textile giant owned by the British firm Courtaulds. It was worth perhaps $120 million at the time, roughly $2.5 billion today. Washington put a gun to Churchill's head. Sell it or no more supplies. In a panicked rush, the British government forced the sale. American bankers, smelling blood in the water, bought the company for roughly half its value. The British Treasury took the loss because they needed the cash to buy bullets for the next week. This pattern repeated itself thousands of times. By the time Pearl Harbor happened and the U.S. entered the war, Britain had already stripped itself of centuries of accumulated wealth. But the real economic time bomb wasn't what they sold. It was what they borrowed. This is the secret that is almost never taught in school. Britain financed the war by treating its colonies like a credit card. It was called the Sterling Area. Countries like India, Egypt, and Ireland sold goods to Britain for the war effort: cotton, wheat, manpower. But Britain didn't pay them. Instead, Britain promised to pay them later. The payments were credited to accounts in the Bank of London. By 1945, Britain owed these countries, its own empire, a staggering £3 billion. In modern terms, that is hundreds of billions of dollars. These were the sterling balances. India was starving, yet it was technically a creditor to Great Britain. Britain had won the war by spending money it didn't have, collateralized by an empire it could no longer afford to keep. When the victory parades marched down the Mall in London in May 1945, the crowds were cheering for a bankrupt state. The official numbers were kept secret to prevent a panic, but inside the Treasury, the mood was funereal. John Maynard Keynes wrote a memo to the cabinet titled, "Our Financial Dunkirk." The language was apocalyptic. He warned that without an immediate injection of cash from the United States, Britain would face a financial Belsen, a reference to the concentration camps, implying economic starvation. The country was importing nearly all its raw materials and half its food. Its factories had been bombed or converted to making tanks, so it had nothing to export to pay for those imports. The deficit was £2 billion a year. The reserves were effectively zero. Attlee and his cabinet looked at the spreadsheet and realized they had only one option. They couldn't tax their way out of this. The British people were already taxed at the highest rates in the world. They couldn't cut spending. The country needed to rebuild. They had to borrow. But who banks the banker? In September 1945, a dying man boarded a ship for Washington. John Maynard Keynes was 62 years old, suffering from a severe heart condition. His doctors told him the trip might kill him. He went anyway. He was the only man with the intellect and the reputation to save the British economy. Keynes went to Washington with a sense of moral superiority. His argument was simple. Britain had fought alone against Hitler from 1939 to 1941. They had sacrificed their economy to save Western civilization. The United States had grown rich during the war, its factories untouched, its GDP doubling. Therefore, Keynes believed the Americans should give Britain a gift. Not a loan. A grant. $6 billion as a retroactive thank you for holding the line. He arrived in Washington expecting a hero's welcome. Instead, he walked into a boardroom of hostile lawyers. The American negotiating team was led by Fred Vinson, the Secretary of the Treasury, and Harry Dexter White, a brilliant but ruthless economist who was secretly passing information to the Soviet Union. They didn't see the war as a moral crusade. They saw it as a closed chapter. The American public was tired of paying for Europe. The war was over. The attitude in Congress was, "Why should we pay for British socialism?" Keynes was shocked. He gave brilliant speeches about sacrifice and justice. The Americans stared back and looked at the numbers. They were willing to offer money, but it wouldn't be a gift. It would be a commercial loan with interest. And worse, there were strings attached. Conditions that had nothing to do with repayment and everything to do with American geopolitical dominance. The Americans hated the imperial preference system. This was a trade agreement where Britain and its colonies traded with each other at lower tariff rates, effectively shutting American goods out of markets like India, Australia, and South Africa. The U.S. State Department saw this as a barrier to American prosperity. They wanted the British Empire's markets cracked open. The negotiation dragged on for months. Keynes grew weaker, suffering heart attacks in his hotel room, popping nitroglycerin pills during breaks. He slowly realized he had no leverage. Britain was literally running out of flour. The Americans knew it. They simply waited. Finally, in December 1945, a deal was on the table. It was brutal. The U.S. offered $3.75 billion. Not the $6 billion Keynes wanted. The interest rate was 2%. But the real killer was a clause buried deep in the contract. Sterling convertibility. This is a complex economic concept, but think of it like this. At the time, if you were a French merchant and you sold wine to England, you got paid in pounds. But you couldn't just take those pounds to a bank and swap them for US dollars. The British government forbade it because they were terrified everyone would sell their pounds for dollars, draining Britain's reserves. The pound was a blocked currency. The Americans demanded that Britain unlock the currency. They insisted that within 1 year of signing the loan, anyone holding pounds must be allowed to swap them for dollars. Keynes was horrified. He knew the world was swimming in unwanted British pounds. If they made the currency convertible, everyone, from Argentine beef merchants to Indian princes, would rush to dump their pounds and buy dollars, because dollars were the only currency that could buy American cars and machines. It would cause a run on the Bank of England. Keynes argued that Britain needed 5 years to rebuild before they could risk this. The Americans gave him 1 year. It was an impossible choice. Reject the loan, and rations in Britain drop below 1,000 calories a day within weeks. Accept the loan, and agree to a condition that might blow up the entire economy a year later. Keynes signed. He described it as walking into the room with a pistol to our head. Back in London, the reaction was fury. Winston Churchill, now the leader of the opposition, railed against the deal in Parliament, calling it a blow to British sovereignty. The press called it an economic Munich. But the Labour government looked at the food stockpiles and realized they had to swallow the poison pill. Parliament voted to accept the loan. The money was wired. The ships kept sailing. Britain could eat. For a moment, it seemed to work. The $3.75 billion flowed into the Treasury. But just as Keynes predicted, the clock was ticking toward the deadline for convertibility. July 15, 1947. The winter of 1947 was one of the worst in British history. Temperatures plunged. Coal stockpiles froze solid. Transport ground to a halt. Factories closed because they had no power. The economy, which was supposed to be recovering, fell off a cliff. Britain was burning through the American loan just to keep people from freezing to death. Then came July 15th, the day the trap snapped shut. Per the agreement, the British government declared that the pound sterling was now convertible. The markets opened. First, it was quiet, but within days, the trickle became a flood. Foreign central banks, merchants, and investors around the world realized they could finally get rid of their British currency and get hard American cash. The run on the bank began. In the first week, Britain lost a few $1,000,000 from its reserves. By the second week, it was tens of millions. By August, the money was draining out of London at a rate of $150 million a week. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Hugh Dalton, watched the ticker tape in horror. It was a financial hemorrhage. The loan money, which was supposed to last 3 years, was vanishing in weeks. The government panicked. If the reserves hit zero, the pound would collapse completely. Britain would be unable to import anything. Society would break down. On August 20th, 1947, just 5 weeks after convertibility began, the British government broke its promise. They suspended convertibility. They slammed the window shut. It was a humiliation on the world stage. They had signed a treaty with the US and then defaulted on the key condition because they were broke. But the damage was already done. The crisis had revealed the truth. Britain was no longer a superpower. Couldn't even manage its own currency. This financial reality forced a geopolitical retreat that changed the map of the world. During that terrible year of 1947, the British government looked at its balance sheet and started cutting costs. What was the biggest cost? The empire. In February 1947, in the midst of the crisis, Britain informed the United States that it could no longer afford to support the Greek government against communist rebels. They were pulling out. This terrified Washington and led directly to the Truman Doctrine, the moment the U.S. officially took over the role of world policeman from Britain. Then came India. For a century, India had been the jewel in the crown. But holding on to it required soldiers, administrators, and money. Britain had none of these. The timeline for Indian independence was accelerated. Lord Mountbatten was sent to wrap things up as quickly as possible. The hasty retreat and partition of India in August 1947, which led to millions of deaths, was driven in large part by the fact that London simply couldn't afford to be there anymore. Then Palestine. Britain held the mandate for Palestine, but the cost of maintaining order between Jewish and Arab populations was hemorrhaging cash. So they handed the problem to the United Nations and packed their bags. The collapse of the British Empire wasn't just about nationalism or freedom fighters, though those were vital. It was, at its core, a bankruptcy proceeding. The $3.75 billion loan was meant to save the empire. Instead, it managed the liquidation. The loan itself became a lingering ghost of the war. It was so massive and the British economy so fragile that the payments stretched out for generations. There is a fascinating coda to this story. The loan that Keynes negotiated in 1945, the money that was supposed to bridge the gap to peacetime, was not paid off in the 1950s or the 1960s. Britain made the final payment on the Anglo-American Loan on December 29, 2006. It took 60 years for the UK to pay for World War II. By the time the final wire transfer was sent to the US Federal Reserve, the British Empire was a distant memory. The pound, which had once been the currency of the world, was a secondary player to the dollar. John Maynard Keynes didn't live to see the chaos of 1947. He died on Easter Sunday, 1946, exhausted by his efforts to save his country from bankruptcy. His doctors said the stress of the Washington negotiations had literally killed him. Today, we look back at 1945 as a victory. But if you follow the money, you see a different story. The transfer of global hegemony from London to Washington wasn't a friendly handing over of the baton. It was a hostile takeover, executed through interest rates, trade clauses, and debt. Britain spent its blood to win the war, but it spent its treasure to survive the peace. The lesson of the Anglo-American Loan is stark. In the world of high-stakes geopolitics, there are no friends, only creditors and debtors. And when the balance sheet turns red, even the greatest empires in history must close up shop.